Recording in progress.
Hey everybody, we're back again with our new talk show, Etched in Stone with Nikki Stone and Larry Sparano. That's me. Nikki is on assignment tonight. I think she's negotiating with the deep state to lay off Trump. I don't know. Just kidding, but maybe not. Anyway, we do have with us a guest, an expert in finance. That's Mark Collinsworth with us here. He is the CIO, the Chief Investment Officer of Vera Global Wealth Management. And appropriately enough, he's here to talk about tonight's topic, which is the big Fed rate cut of 50% basis point. That's a half a percentage. That's big for the Fed. And we're going to talk first about what effect it's going to have on you, your finances, and your future, and what effect it's going to have on the nation. Now, Mark, thanks for being here. And first of all, tell us about the size of the rate cut. That is unusual, is it not?
50 basis points, yes, is quite a bit for cutting when the economy is not in recession. And this is also a rare event. Very, very, very rarely do you see the Fed cut interest rates when jobs are still being created. And even more to the point, it's rare to see the Fed cut interest rates when inflation is actually above their target rate.
It's also rare for them to do it right before an election, is it not? Or have they done that?
Well, that's a first in history.
Really?
Yeah.
So Jerome Powell, the chair of the Fed, can he be accused of having his hand and his thumb on the scale here to help Kamala win the election?
Absolutely. My two main driving points there is, why is the Fed cutting interest rates when the economy is still creating jobs? And more importantly, all you've heard for the last 2 years, we're targeting 2% inflation, 2%, 2%, 2%. And here we are at 3.6%, and the Fed cuts interest rates, just not 25 basis points, but 50 basis points, roughly 47 days out for an election.
So apparently they don't care about the fallout that they're going to be accused of tipping the scale for Kamala. They're doing it anyway.
Well, absolutely, because Trump's already dropped several hints that if he's reelected, Janet Yellen and Jeremy Powell are going to hit the road with, you're fired.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, he's upsetting everybody's apple cart, so, they got a lot to lose if he gets in. So would you say then that this will be a winner for Kamala?
Yeah, this is going to help out quite a bit. She's already going to end up winning the popular vote. And just looking at how polls are going in, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, those are so close. It's a flip of the coin right now. But what should be concerning Harris is that Those three states, which are part of the blue wall, it's so close up there. That says something about the Democratic Party that three states they used to be able to rely on religiously to vote for them is a 50-50 toss up right now.
Well, we were going to talk about the effect on people out there, but now we're discussing the effect on the economy generally. So, what happens with this rate cut? Is it going to create at least the appearance of prosperity quickly enough to put Kamala into the White House? What are the effects of it?
The short term effects is when the Fed cuts interest rates, the stock market's going to shoot up. And of course, people always vote with their pocketbook. So when people get their statements at the end of this month, and if the rally continues through October, they're going to see their portfolios going up and feel like, well, hey, the Bidenomics is working. I need to stick with that. But here's my counter question of that: if Bidenomics is working so great, why did the Fed need to cut rates 50 basis points?
Yeah, well, I mean, for those that don't have a lot of stock and all that, what effect will it be on them beneficially? I mean, when they go to the grocery store, are prices going to drop? Et cetera, et cetera. I mean, what effect besides stocks will it have?
Well, actually, with the Fed cutting interest rates, historically, that anytime the Fed's cut rates, that's viewed as an inflationary event. If you look at the 30-year Treasury bond, which is the most sensitive to changes in interest rates, i.e., in changes in long-term inflation, the 30-year Treasury bond actually sold off a little bit here in the last day or so.
So again, I mean, people that are paying car payments, mortgage rates, all that, will they see an immediate effect, a reduction, and beneficial to them?
Well, not an immediate effect. By the way, the credit card companies are set up. If the Fed cut interest rates now, you cannot see a change in credit card rates until the next billing cycle starts up. So technically, if your billing cycle ended yesterday, you won't see a cut in your credit card interest rates for another 30 days out.
And how about prices, food, gas, et cetera, et cetera?
I am going to assume prices are probably actually going to go up. One thing I will also add, FedEx, which, the economy moves on transportation, right? FedEx reported earnings this evening. The earnings report was horrible, but more to the point, FedEx gave a horrible outlook on the economy going forward, which is causing their stock to drop like a rock.
Well, wait a minute. You just said that despite the 50%, 50 basis point cut, half a percentage point, which is big, despite that, prices are going to go up?
Prices will probably go up because the Fed cut interest rates and now is adding money into the economy. That should increase the demand for goods. Problem we have with inflation right now is we have too much demand and not enough supply. So by cutting interest rates, you're going to increase demand even more, putting a bigger strain on the supply equation.
All right, so I'm still trying to figure out then, I mean, what is the overall effect or impression it will have on people? Will they suddenly think that they're doing better, the economy is better, we're in better shape than we were before this rate cut, or is it going to be pretty much the same or worse?
Well, two things are going to happen, and this goes to the people that really aren't educated on this. One, you're going to see a spike up in the stock market. All recessions, when the Fed cuts interest rates, you always get a rally in the stock market after the Fed cuts interest rates. But why is the Fed cutting interest rates? It's not because the world is filled with rainbows and unicorns. They're cutting those rates because there's a problem. But when people go to the polls, the Democrats are going to pound the table. Hey, we're cutting interest rates. We're trying to give support to the economy. Blah blah blah. They're not going to talk about how that Fed rate cut could cause inflation to actually get worse.
Now, are there any consequences for Jerome Powell and the board, the Fed, for doing this so close to an election? I mean, is there going to be any kind of blowback of consequence, or are they just going to skate through all this?
He's going to skate through all this because the next congressional hearing where Jeremy Powell actually has to go in front and Janet Yellen has to go in front of Congress and explain what they are doing or not doing to help the economy, that meeting or that conference is going to be after the election. So after the election, it'll already be done, the person will already be elected, and
For those who follow my podcast, you'll know that Mark is a familiar figure. We talk about the economy quite a bit. And Mark, as I recall, I think correctly, you were saying a while back, in terms of the election and the future of the economy, that there would be a rally for a while post-election, but then we're heading into a deep situation, a big recession, correct? Do I have that right?
Well, kind of. So we are going to have a recession. I think we're going to have probably a mild recession probably next year because the Fed is cutting interest rates. We're already heading towards recession. The SOM indicator, which back here in
Explain that.
August,
Explain
like
that.
the SOM indicator created by Claudia Somm, she was a Federal Reserve governor, is based on the percentage change of unemployment from the 3 month moving average. So basically, it's how much the 3 month. It's basically it's the indicator measures how quick unemployment went up over a 3 month period, and that indicator actually flipped to recession back here in August. So based on that indicator, the economy should actually officially be in a recession here in roughly the next 4 months.
You're a financial advisor. What's your advice to people out there that have investments?
Well, if we have a mild recession, mild recessions are fairly easy to navigate. You just own high quality companies, own companies that are like consumer staples, things that people have to use, repeat business basically. The companies that normally get hit the hardest in mild recessions are companies that depend on the consumer spending. Car companies, manufacturing companies, those are the ones that take it kind of on the nose. Now, if we have a deep recession like a 2008, a 1974 type recession, really the only place to be at on that is in cash. There's really no place to hide in the stock market on those kind of
Uh,
recessions.
and by the way, for those who are viewing us, there's a call-in number on the screen. Also, you could come in by Zoom and be seen, or at least heard by Zoom. So the numbers are on the screen right there. So Mark, longer term, I mean, there's been so much prognostication that we're heading into the biggest recession, the biggest depression, the greatest depression, even worse than 1929. Now, is that highly exaggerated? Is it somewhat possible? What is your prognosis?
I think it's extremely possible, and the main reason behind that is the government has just taken on just way too much debt. So for this year already, we've already paid $1 trillion in interest payments on our debt, and the year's not over with. We're already pushing what, 34, $35 trillion. And
Hmm.
just to kind of give you a perspective on what a trillion looks like, do you know what was happening 1 trillion seconds ago?
What?
1 trillion seconds ago was 28,000 years ago, and cavemen were drawing on the walls. And we're talking $35 trillion in debt here. We're going to have to borrow next year. We're going to have to borrow an additional $1 trillion just to make the interest payments on our debt.
So that's not sustainable.
That is not. And long term, I think the catalyst that will kill it, you've heard all the talk about um, the dollar losing its reserve status. And for people who don't know what reserve status means, all oil in the world has to be bought and sold in US dollars.
Right.
So with US dollars, so what happens that keeps our interest rates low? If you're a foreign country and you need to buy, let's say, $500 million worth of oil for the year, you just go out and buy $500 million worth of US Treasury bonds. So we always have money. We always have constant people buying bonds because if you're going to have to spend the money on oil, why not have it earning 3 or 4%, 5% paid in US dollars? What will happen when the US dollar is no longer the reserve currency and there's a competitor for it and you don't have people buying our bonds anymore?
Well, they've been talking about that for quite some time now, that the dollar will eventually lose its reserve status and game over when that happens. Why is the game over if that happens? What does
Well,
that,
because
how does that affect?
well, the reason right now it's just like you think the globe is kind of it's kind of like the banks. They're basically giving us money. They're borrowing money, or we're borrowing money from them. And so there's always a constant action. So it's basically like your credit card. Right now, we have an unlimited credit card to spend on.
Right.
And now you get used to that unlimited credit card spending. What happens when the credit card company says, hey, we're cutting you off? You can't spend anymore.
Well, there's some that say since the government can print money, unlimited amounts, they could keep this going forever. Can they not?
Well, they cannot. There's a certain point to where you reach critical mass to where the foreign countries just won't be borrowing our money.
Because there's nothing to back it up. It's way
Well,
overextended.
Well, no, because at that point there'll be a competitor that actually comes in. Let's say the euro becomes a competitor for the reserve status. Now you can buy oil or sell oil in euros and you don't have to rely on the dollar. So that will cause less people to actually go toward the dollar, which
Uh,
a declining dollar also causes inflation.
and by the way, they call it the petrodollar. What's the history of that? How did that occur?
The petrodollar was actually negotiated, I think, back here in the mid 1940s with Saudi Arabia. That and the unofficial deal was, hey, you make this is for OPEC, make the dollar the official currency for oil to be traded in, and the United States basically will be your private army to deal with problems that comes about.
Right, right.
Now, what's interesting, this is the very interesting part. Did you know that contract that was signed in the 1940s, it comes up for renewal every, I think, so many years? Back here 3 months ago, Saudi Arabia refused to sign that contract to keep it in place.
Is that right?
Mhm.
I don't think that made the mainstream news, did it?
It did not make the mainstream news.
I,
So technically, Saudi Arabia is still using the dollar as its reserve currency, but they're no longer obligated by a contract to do it.
wow. Now, yeah, here's another factor. Even if the government wanted to do something about it and contradict the Fed, the government really has no control over the Fed, right? No direct control.
Well, no, because the Federal Reserve is a private bank. There's nothing federal about. The old saying goes, Federal Reserve is about as federal Express. That's just
Yeah,
in name only.
yeah. And you know, there's quite an interesting history of how the Federal Reserve was created and, and who created it. It wasn't the ordinary citizen.
Well, correct. Even if you go back and look at how the vote took place um, for the Federal Reserve, it was very questionable. Even more to the point, let's talk about the the Tax Act that actually made income taxes that created the IRS. It strikes me as very odd that the vote that they passed to create the income tax system actually passed on Christmas Eve
Yeah, when nobody was around, it was just the people
when
that they
nobody
knew
was
would pass
around.
it.
So,
Yeah,
and back in 1913, when that was signed, Congress people didn't have airplanes to fly on. They had to go by train. So if they was in Washington, D.C. on Christmas Eve, there's no way they could have got back to their family in Nevada or California or even Michigan in time for Christmas because you had to go by train.
yeah. How
So it's
about
very suspect.
how about Jekyll Island? Even that sounds ominous. Just the name, Dr.
It
Jekyll and
does. It
Mr.
sounds like,
Hyde.
yeah, exactly. Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Exactly. And what's interesting about that is you had this private meeting that was held by some of the richest people in the world, J.P. Morgan. You had people from Europe in there, and they drew up the Federal Reserve Act,
This
which is
is
interesting. But
this was on Jekyll Island, right?
on Jekyll Island,
Yeah.
which is also interesting because the Federal Reserve Act also, the Federal Reserve actually has stock in it. It actually has stock issued, preferred stock that pays a 6% dividend yield on it. So somebody owns stock in the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve Act specifically says that the owners of the stock cannot be named.
So we don't know who owns the Fed, right?
Correct. Now, that question has come up in front of Bernanke at one time, and he said it's the Federal Reserve banks actually own the stock. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me.
It's the people behind those banks.
Correct.
Yeah, and we don't know who they are.
We do not. Another interesting thing, when the first Federal Reserve Board, there was a guy on the Federal Reserve Board named Warburg. Warburg, he was a German American. He's actually was part back in the early 1900s. The Warburg Bank was kind of the equivalent of what a J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs would be thought of as today. It was the largest bank, or one of the largest banks in Europe.
Uh-huh.
So Mr. Warburg's family, who's a German, and the Warburg Bank is headquartered in Germany. He sat on the Federal Reserve Board, and we went to war with Germany. So Mr. Warburg had the option here to disrupt the economy to help out his family's business, but he opted not to. Now, why is that?
Interesting.
Because did the Warburg family have stock in the Federal Reserve and they knew long term that the Warburg banking system could collapse, but as long as they held stock in the Federal Reserve, that was more valuable to them.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
There's a lot of criticism about the Federal Reserve, how it was created, who's behind it, all that, the mystery, who really has the control of it. But the other side of the argument is that without the Fed, there would be so many erratic ups and downs in the stock market. In fact, that's the main reason for the creation of the Fed, to stabilize the stock market. Do you buy that argument?
Well, let's go with this, Larry. Name a stock market crash that you know of.
29.
Queen, oh, right, Queen, name another one.
We had the one in what,
87.
87, yeah.
87. Name another one. 2008.
2008, all right.
Right, let's go. Let's add 1974 in there. Let's add the 1982 crash. Let's just add those in there. Is something that all those things have in common? They all occurred after the Federal Reserve. You don't hear a lot of stock market crashes that occurred before the Federal Reserve, now do you?
Well, what was the supposed impetus to create the Federal Reserve? I thought there was some crash, and that's why they were able to justify the creation of the Fed.
Well, I'm glad you actually said that. There was
Thank you.
actually what was called the poor man's crash of 1908.
Hmm.
And that was actually used as the basis that J.P. Morgan argued that was the basis for why a Federal Reserve banking system needed to be created. But this is kind of thing. There's a lot of theories and rumors out there that J.P. Morgan was actually the person that actually caused the crash.
Hmm. Which was the reason, yeah, they were able to pass it
Yeah.
through. Uh, how about the BRICS? We hear a lot about that. How much of a threat is that? That's what, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, right?
Yeah, and you could actually trade out South Africa for also Singapore. Now, Singapore is a very fast growing country
Yeah.
in Asia. The BRICS, the BRICS are classified as like an emerging market to invest in. I really wouldn't classify the BRICS as a whole. I think if you're really looking for an emerging market to invest in, I really think India is where you're going to have your most pop from
Really?
long term. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody says that that this century is going to evolve into China's century, considering their roaring economy, how everything's been outsourced to China, that China is going to dominate the world economically and perhaps even militarily. What's your reading on that?
I would probably say that that's probably more truth about it being militarily. I don't really think China at this stage, unless the Chinese yuan can become the reserve currency, I really don't see them becoming a major economic super powerhouse. Um, the countries that normally have the strongest economies are the ones that have the most capital or most constant capital inflow. That's one of the reasons the United States has done so well because its currency is the reserve currency. You have a constant flow of capital into the country.
But if the dollar loses its reserve status,
That will open up the door for a new player to come in and be the next economic superpower.
and that player would most probably be who?
Ooh, unfortunately, that goes back to the original question. It could possibly be China.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I say.
Um,
Uh,
and, and the reason why I mentioned China is because Russia and China, when the Ukraine war started and the United States put all those sanctions on Russia with, knocking them out of SWIFT and all that stuff, that's where the Russians and the Chinese actually started talking about coming up with a new reserve currency
yeah.
that possibly could be backed by gold or Bitcoin and to create another system outside of SWIFT.
All this outsourcing in China. Now, a lot of people don't realize this. Biden was one of the ringleaders, one of the cheerleaders that got China admitted to the World Trade Organization and then also give them most favored nation status. Now he's been talking about how, China, well, he used to say China won't eat our lunch, that's ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. Now he's, soft pedaling that. But, what happened basically, my reading is, once they found out that China, could manufacture things much more cheaply than here with the unions and all that, they outsourced it so they could produce it cheaply, import it back in the U.S., make big profits, and that started the gutting of the industrial base. Now, wasn't there anybody who saw the long-term effects of this and tried to stop it, or did they all pile on board?
Oh, the people that saw the long-term effects for it were very well positioned to benefit from it.
So therefore, well, you know, here's another question. All right, they're making the upfront profits, you know, immense profits, but eventually they're destroying the market that's enriching them. Or is that not a factor because by then it's a worldwide market and they've already made their money? I mean, in other words, how come they don't fear the eventual consequences?
The eventual consequences that China could basically run the United States out of business.
That I mean, yeah, what they're doing is weakening the buying power of the American consumer. So aren't they cutting off their nose to spite their face?
Not, not really. Because the goods are so, if it does, it's going to be a long, long time down the road. China still has a lot of probably punch they can throw into the mix. I'm sure you've seen where they're building all these factories here in the United States, and
Yeah,
Trump has already said, if you build those factories here, I'm still going to put a tariff on you.
yeah.
China is very bad about manipulating dollar, their currency, to try to force consumers in the United States to buy their goods. Um, at some point that might actually blow up on them. But for right now, they're making money hand over fist, just like with the housing bubble. Nobody really yelled about the housing bubble being a problem until people stopped making money in it.
Well, this is what I'm saying. I mean, long term, if you strip the middle class and the working class of its buying power, who's going to buy the goods, no matter how cheap they are? Or do they figure that so far down the road they don't care?
It's so far down the road they don't care.
And
And
when
even then, and think of this, it's another theory. Think about this, and this has kind of been thrown out there also. Is it the goal of China to basically, like you're saying, destroy the consumer's buying power so that the United States virtually becomes like, second world country?
yeah.
Take that, and China has enough U.S. Treasury bonds. If they dumped all those Treasury bonds on the U.S. market at one time, they could jack up interest rates high enough that it would actually cause a pretty bad recession in the United States. What would stop China? Because China's military is growing by leaps and bounds. That could set the stage for a U.S. invasion.
Of China.
U.S. invasion, China invading the United States. Yes.
China invading the United States, yeah. Uh, well, I mean, you know, what happens then? I mean, you know, there's always, people always say they wouldn't do it because of our nuclear weapons.
True, but if you've already got chaos going on in your own country, it's not hard to infiltrate that and basically debase everything. And plus, I don't think the United States would ever use nukes on their own soil.
Okay, what I want to talk about is something that's of concern to, you know, millions and millions of Americans: the future of Social Security. Is it going to end, as some people are saying, or are they just alarmists?
Well, I would think Social Security should have ended. Social Security is technically bankrupt. It's on a major life support system right now. And yes, Social Security's days are probably numbered, or at the very least, the Social Security system we see today is numbered. I just don't see how you can have a system to where for every one person contributing to Social Security, there's seven people pulling money out. I mean, where's that extra money come from?
Oh, so what happens? I mean, you know, so many people are dependent on their Social Security.
Well, that could go into the thing that, people always kick the can down the road and don't worry about it because they say it's somebody else's problem. They just want to benefit on the good. But you kick the can down the road long enough, the can does kick back. At some point, this may occur in our lifetimes. It may not occur in our lifetimes. But Social Security is absolutely doomed to fail. There's just no way to save it.
So what will replace it, if anything?
Nothing will replace it.
So people will be retiring without Social Security.
Correct.
So how do they manage?
That goes into that scenario where I think, people when people think about depression, they think the Great Depression. Well, the United States has actually had several depressions over the years. I give you an example. There was actually a depression that occurred right after the Civil War, for obvious reasons. It's called the Long Depression. The 1907, 1908 stock market decline was actually referred to as a depression. Because really, the definition of depression is simply a recession that lasts more than 2 years. So the US economy has had multiple depressions, which were really recessions that lasted more than 2 years.
And therefore, what?
Well, therefore, what I'm saying is, but you've also had those depressions like the depression after the Civil War and the depression in the 1930s were really, really bad. What's stopping us from having another really, really bad depression like that?
Yeah.
There's not a month left.
Well, but again, getting back to Social Security. So if that ends, well, first of all, what's your projection of when it could end?
Oh, I predicted Social Security. Actually, when I was in graduate school, I actually did a research paper on this. I was actually predicting it to be bankrupt by 2010.
It's
But guess
not.
what? It's still here. It's still
Yeah.
here.
So, I mean, how soon can we expect it not to be here?
I think that's going to come down. What's going to really come down to it is the dollar's reserve status. Right now, Social Security is being funded with borrowed money from foreign countries. What happens when those foreign countries no longer want to give the United States money?
Okay, again, there's some people that say, well, scrap Social Security and privatize it. I think President Bush tried to do that. And that would be even more beneficial to recipients because there'd be a better
It,
return through the stock market than Social Security. Is that a valid projection?
it would be better, but the United States government cannot do that because if you set up that kind of Social Security system, an investment portfolio like a 401k plan, the United States wouldn't get it. Remember, we talked about the reason why the United States keeps being the United States is because people keep on borrowing this money, right?
Mhm.
The Social Security system, all the money, all the current money in the Social Security system, there's no money in it. It's filled with IOUs to the United States government. Your Social Security money is a constant flow. When Social Security taxes come out of my paycheck, that goes straight into a bond for the United States government. And so the United States government is borrowing money from me through the Social Security system.
So,
So
in terms of privatizing it, how does that affect it?
if you privatized it, the Social Security system, the government would lose its one of its main sources of cash flow.
So the government won't allow privatization.
They will never allow it because if that if okay, so right now when Social Security taxes come out of my paycheck, it goes to the United States government as a loan, and they buy T bills or T bonds. It's issued in T bonds, earning 2 or 3% on my money. If it's privatized, that money no longer goes to the United States. It will go to another account like at Fidelity or Charles Schwab or something like that, and the United States government will cut off hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue that it gets through the Social Security system.
Well, when President Bush was pushing for it, I believe it was President Bush, was he serious about it or he didn't realize the effect? Why were they pushing that?
Well, in Congress, there are some people that come up with really good ideas. Then again, there's a whole other system of people that sit there and go, that's a bad idea because it's going to cut off our spending power. Think about it. The taxes that come out of my Social Security taxes that come out of my paycheck, that's the exact same money that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund, which is basically loaned to the United States government. And then the United States government takes that money once they give it and they give it to Iran. They put it in a welfare system. So my Social Security dollars are going to support programs that I don't want.
So it's not a lockbox, as who was it? Gore was talking
No,
about that.
it's not a lockbox. It's open. That's where a lot of the things that the government spends money on, that's coming from the Social Security system. That's a revenue source for the government.
Even the concept of privatization, to me, it didn't seem like it workable because with Social Security, even though it may be doomed in the future, right now you could depend on a steady income every month.
Mhm.
You know it's going to be there. You know it's not going to fluctuate. If you put it into the stock market through privatization, then if the stock market fluctuates, so does your payment. So how is
Well,
that
yes,
how is that better than the Social Security system?
here's the thing. Inflation's running at what? 3.6% right now?
Well, that's the rate of increase. It's actually what 20-25%.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the Social Security, the money that goes into the Social Security system, it's only growing. It's in T bonds, growing at 3 or 4%. Over the next, could you survive on money that's growing at 3 or 4%? No, I mean, the inflation rate alone is killing it right there. So your Social Security check technically is already being eaten up due to inflation.
Yeah. I'd also want to bring up the effect of Trump's tariffs. Now, he's saying, tariffs are the way to prevent China from dominating the U.S. market and other countries as well. What do you think of that?
I think that's a great idea. It's such a great idea that when Biden and Harris actually took over the office, they kept those tariffs in place. They could have easily gotten rid of them, but they didn't because it's too much money.
Well, what they're claiming, though, publicly is that, well, tariffs are really a tax on the public because if you put a tariff on a product, a foreign product, then you're paying more for that product. So, in effect, it's a tax increase. What do you think of
Correct.
that argument?
I disagree with that because what would a person rather have? Would they rather have an American, let's say they have an American product that costs, $12 or a Chinese product, the exact same Chinese product that costs $6?
Hmm.
Well, people would probably prefer, say, to have, well, the $6. But now it comes down to if you want to buy that $6 product, you don't have a job.
Yeah, yeah,
So if you keep buying Chinese products, you're basically shooting yourself. And that's why, like I'm sure you saw the Teamsters. The Teamsters, for the first time
yeah.
since 1996, are not going to endorse the Democrats. But this is the crazy part. The Teamsters did an internal poll. 60% of the Teamsters support Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So why didn't the Teamsters come out and actually say we support Donald Trump?
Well, because they're hedging their bets. If Kamala gets in, they're going to be knocking on her door, so they don't want to alienate her just in case she becomes president.
That's true too, but that's a big thing that the Teamsters, which is supposed to be the most blue collar worker on the planet, is saying they don't like Harris.
Yeah, yeah. Well, all right, Mark, I think we'll wrap it up for tonight. But closing comment is the election is in November, very, very short time. You're predicting that Kamala will be president, or you're saying it could go either way?
Ooh, what's really going to come down to is, there's not, I won't call, there's not cheating that goes on in the voting, but there's a lot of rules that just aren't fair. Like states that are allowed to count ballots a week or 2 weeks after the election,
Yeah,
that's not fair. States that allow ballots to be counted that don't even have a date signed to them,
right.
that's not fair.
Yeah,
I mean, you have states like I think in Michigan, they found how many thousands of people in Michigan did they find that were still legally registered to vote, but they've been dead for years. And the Michigan Voting Commission refuses to take their names off the rolls. I mean, what's up with that?
well, Mark, let's be reasonable here. Just because somebody dies is no reason to deny them how they would have voted as a staunch
Correct.
Democrat, right? I
Yes,
mean, I
that's why
mean,
I want on my tombstone it's going to say, "Please don't let me vote Democrat now."
that's a good party shot. All right, Mark Collinsworth, the CIO, the Chief Investment Officer of Bear Global Wealth Management. Thanks once again for your perspective. And Nikki will be back with us next week, so stay tuned. See you later, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep.